This week on the Futurists, the U.S. election.
This, I think, is a scary thing for the United States. We have always had some low-level corruption at every level of government here, but overt corruption from the White House, I think, will be a new thing. It'll set a new low standard.
Well, this is it. We're back on the Futurists. I am your host, Brett King, and in the co-hosting chair is my good pal, Rob Tursek. Rob, how are you?
Hey. Hi, Brad. How you been?
Good. You getting ready for your big hike, man? When is that?
I am. I'm going to be going up to Ken Stanley Robinson territory, the Sierras.
Nice.
You know, it's quite an interesting thing because usually when people drive through the central part of California, they think those mountains are all dry and deserty because on the ground level, that's how they are. But once you get up above 10,000 feet, they're more like the Swiss Alps. There's snow, there's mountains, there used to be glaciers. I don't know if there still are. There's lakes, very green. So,
it's really interesting because when just as you described that, it sounds like the description Stan put in his Mars novels when they were when the terraforming started. You know,
I'm telling you, that's where he gets his inspiration.
It's clear. It's clear.
Like, the guy's been going up there for 50 years. He goes and spends a couple weeks a year up in the Sierras. So that's going to be my big summer adventure. We're going to be off the grid, carrying our own food and everything else for 10 days.
So for 10 days, you get to enjoy the bliss of not hearing about the U.S. election.
That's exactly right. That's the idea. I'm going to opt out. I am going to pull the ripcord and cut off all communication. I can't wait to find out what happened because it's been such a roller coaster in the month of July. Holy Toledo, what a month we've had.
So you want to go over the sequence of what's happened so far? Because I think it's worthy of us as futurists to sort of give our take on this. It's a moment in history for people listening. People around the world are watching this with interest, even where I am in Asia. Of course, everyone's talking about what's going to happen and the fun and games. Because, the US is obviously a major world power and, decisions like this, the election of Trump, last time had major impact globally and, would likely again. And so everyone's, watching this very carefully.
Yeah, sure thing.
But where does it fit,
this has been a bumpy ride we've had in a couple of months. Usually there's a lot of ceremony and there's some formality around the election process. But of course, with Trump, it's more chaotic. He tends to throw a brick through the window when it comes to formality and process. And we saw that on display in the debate. The one debate between President Biden and former President Trump in June, where Trump came in and unleashed just a torrent of attacks, including a lot of falsehoods, and really threw Biden off his stride. And he was struggling to even respond. Came off as a disastrous outing for the current president. And the Republicans have been on a roll since June. And of course, in the middle of July, we had the Republican National Convention. But up to that event, there was
before the convention, we had Trump, the assassination attempt.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So on July 13th, just a day before the convention was supposed to start, Trump was giving a rally and had a very near miss with an attempted assassination. Very peculiar story because it's a huge security lapse on the part of our Secret Service. They are known to do a very good job of protecting presidents and candidates, but not in this case. That attempted assassin had flown a drone to scan the area 2 hours before the rally began.
Crazy.
To find like the ideal spot, and weirdly they had they even had him in their sights. They had tracked the fellow as an unusual character with a backpack, but they lost track of him. So that incident occurred, they galvanized the public interest, quite an extraordinary near miss. Huge day of fundraising followed for Trump, huge amount of support, outpouring of support Trump's from his supporters.
Yep.
And then he cruised into the Republican National Congress, kind of reinvigorated, right? Because he had absolutely trounced Biden in this debate and then survived this assassination attempt. So he looked almost anointed. Some people said it was godlike or he had been appointed by God. He had all this kind of crazy euphoria. And then at the National Convention, there were a couple of strange things that happened. One is that he named J.D. Vance as his vice president. And for folks who've been following or haven't followed the story, J.D. Vance is a sort of faux populist who wrote Hillbilly Elegy, which is a book about his childhood upbringing. in Ohio. And a lot of people said it's not a true story, or it's a assemblage of mythology about hillbillies in the United States. In any case, that's that's sort of his story about his own formation. But Vance is brought in to be an attack dog, and he's quite good at that. But he appeals to Trump's MAGA base, this sort of core set of super angry, very conservative populist voters. Doesn't really appeal far outside of that. And the way he was announced was very strange. It just came in as a text message to some of the delegates. Usually that's a big reveal at the convention. And then the convention was kind of ended with one of the most bizarre moments. I think, as everybody knows, President Trump is a little bit unhinged. He'll go off message, I guess is how they say it in politics. So at his acceptance speech, which could have just been a normal, sedate acceptance speech where he was reading a teleprompter, instead he went off the rails and began ranting, as he has a habit of doing. So he kind of is his own worst enemy. I'm not making this up. This is in the Wall Street Journal this morning, which, that's like the House organ of the Republican Party. They should be his biggest supporters. And even they said, like, he shoots himself in the foot when he goes off script. And he goes off on these hate-filled rants, and they're kind of undisciplined. Following that, the Republican Party was on such a high, and that's when Joe Biden dropped the bomb the following week, announcing that he was going to step down. Of course, there'd been pressure for weeks, 3 weeks of pressure from the Democratic Party on Joe Biden. People felt that he couldn't win the election, and he announced that he was not going to run for re-election. He was going to step down, turned around and endorsed his vice president, Kamala Harris. And Kamala, within 24 hours, raised the most money of any U.S. candidate. About $100 million of donations poured in. So effectively, the Democratic Party went from being defeatist and bummed out and freaking out about their candidate to having a new candidate appointed and a surge of support for her. So the dynamics have changed in a matter of weeks in the U.S. election. It's quite an exciting time. And I would say generally, it's actually good for U.S. politics because you got people on both sides of the political spectrum who are super engaged. And for the people in the middle who are undecided, well, now there's a new candidate that they get to evaluate. So suddenly there's this fresh energy
instead
in the
of
election cycle.
Instead of the debate about two
old white guys,
which is
So now you're going to have
like how representative is that? Yes, there's an older population in the States, but the younger people don't feel as represented. But what's interesting is
right?
Well, but here's the thing: Biden always said he was only going to be a single-term president.
He should have stuck to that.
The earlier election, right?
I think it's pretty irresistible, though, when you're the president. It's almost like an impossible thing to resist, right? The lure of going.
I mean, it is. I mean, it's a rarity that you have in politics at this level that you have someone just step aside for the good of the country. But that appears what he's done.
Look, he's a good public servant.
Yeah, like obviously there was issues. Reagan had issues in the final years of his presidency, particularly the final year, and no one's going after 25th Amendment to have him removed. So we have had this issue occur in U.S. politics, but it certainly has taken on a different turn these days, and I don't know why that is. Is that because we have much more media focus? Is it as
partly
much more personality
the baby
based?
boom generation has dominated American politics for 30 years, and people are restless to see them shuffle off stage. But here's the interesting thing, Brett. With Biden dropping out, it actually kind of it set a trap for the Republicans. I should say they set a trap for themselves because they have been bashing at Biden for being old and senile for 3 years now, nonstop. Right? It's just been a steady drumbeat
because it works for them, right?
It does now. But now that he dropped out, guess who's the old candidate? Because Trump's only a couple years younger than Biden.
Yes,
so now you've got this
and
he
has his gaffes of his own, right? He goes off script.
Exactly.
Okay, it wasn't as bad as Mitch McConnell freezing out.
We've got all these septuagenarians and 80-year-olds in our U.S. government. It's time for them to sort of step aside. But anyway, so now it leaves Trump vulnerable to the exact same criticisms that the Republicans have been making of Biden. And there's one other element, which is that Trump's got a mental disorder. He's clearly somewhat unhinged. I don't think that that's like too speculative of a statement. George Conroy, I know
The Lincoln Project's done some really excellent work and so forth. But I think you have to be a little bit kooky to get to that level of politics. There's not a natural desire for people to want to be the ruler of the free world, right? You have to be a little bit insane, I think, to want to be president. I don't know.
Okay.
I mean,
now
you're
you're
calling to national service itself, but
well,
I'm
I
not
think
saying
most
Trump
candidates
is
would tell
pretty.
themselves that. Yeah.
Well, Trump is obviously an extreme example of that, but we had it with Nixon. We certainly had it with, we had a bit of this with JFK, a bit of this was Clinton. So
yeah, at that level, they do start to get a self-aggrandizement going. There's sort of a premise that they're all powerful. Hey, look, it is the most powerful job in the world. So I guess that goes straight to your head, right? But then again, no other candidate in history has lied as consistently and as much and as outrageously, as easily disproven as Trump. Like he lied some 30,000 times in public statements while he was in office. So this is a little bit different, I think, significantly different from other candidates, even if they are megalomaniacal in their own individual ways. And now Kamala Harris, people have to remember, is a prosecutor, right? So she was the attorney general in California, and she prosecuted criminals, and she's making a huge deal out of this. Is going to be a central theme in her campaign.
Yeah.
She keeps saying, I know
she's
the
going
type,
up
right?
against
I know
another
what Trump
felony.
is. He's a criminal mind.
Yeah. But, she's the presumptive nominee.
Yeah, but she's locked it up now. She's got all the delegates she needs.
And there's two obvious VP candidates for her. One is Gavin Newsom, and the other is Pete Buttigieg. In my mind.
Oh no, they're not going to be. No, I don't think that's likely.
Who do you think?
No, it's probably going to be Mark Kelly, who is a senator from Arizona.
Oh yeah, astronaut.
He's an astronaut. He was. People forget he was also a jet fighter pilot for the U.S.
Mark
Navy.
Kelly's, he flew
the real deal, multiple
man.
combat missions in the Gulf War. So he is like a real, fighter ace, I suppose. Which is a great contrast to.
And he spent a year
Vance.
in space, So
yeah, that's exactly right. So he stacks up nicely against JD Vance. JD Vance was also had military service, but he worked in like the PR department for the Army, so he doesn't have any combat experience. And then the other factor is that there's sort of a sad story there, which is the way Mark Kelly got into politics is that his wife was actually a congresswoman.
Yes,
and she got gunned down in some crazy gun incident when she was campaigning. She survived that, and now they have both come out as very strong supporters of gun control. So, in a way, he's like a living testimony to the wacky gun laws we have in the U.S. and the need for gun control.
And no one could say he's not prepared to defend himself or defend America because he's done his service.
Yeah. He's got great bona fides, and he offsets where Kamala Harris is a little bit weak. He's got some great depth. The other great candidate would be Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania. He's the governor of Pennsylvania. And again, another middle-of-the-road guy who knows how to win over middle-of-the-road voters. So these are strong candidates, but we're going to find out. In a matter of weeks, we're going to have the Democratic National Convention, which is where they're going to officially, coronate Kamala as the main.
That seems a fait accompli, right?
I think she's locked up enough delegate votes now to guarantee it. Yeah. There's also some issues around who gets to use the campaign funds, but I think that's all just technical stuff. So anyway, that'll get sorted out at the Democratic Convention, where she will announce her VP pick, and then it's game on. And then we're going to have 2 solid months of intense barnstorming across the country to galvanize voters, to reach out to people who don't know her and aren't familiar.
Such a circus.
It's going to dominate the cycle for the next couple of months. I'm actually excited about it because I love to see Americans get involved in politics. I love to see people get energized about it. I love to debate with people about it. So this is going to be a fun couple of months. One thing to watch for, I think, is Kamala is going to talk about Trump's criminal record.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds a little extreme because we've heard the Republicans talk about the Biden crime family and so forth. But one of the things you probably have noticed, is that Trump tends to project whatever he's doing onto other people, right? So if he's preoccupied with his own feeling of guilt,
that's his experience base,
he'll cast it on somebody else. He sort of throws it at other people first. So he's already accusing Kamala of committing crimes, which is a baseless accusation. She hasn't done that. Meanwhile, Trump's been found guilty, and he's a convicted felon.
Right.
with 34 counts of fraud
Yep.
on a hush money case. And of course, there are 4 other major cases underway. And don't forget, in the past, he's also been convicted of fraud, or he's been found guilty of fraud.
Yes.
Trump University, where he had to pay a
Yep.
$25 million settlement,
Trump.
and his foundation.
Trump
He had
Foundation.
the Donald Trump Foundation in New York, where he also had to do a $2 million settlement there and admit that he had personally misused funds for personal political purposes. So the guy kind of has a track record of fraud. Now, here's an interesting thing, Brett, that I didn't know. I just read this morning. If Trump happens to get elected, like if he wins this election, and currently he's ahead, so he could, there are 37 nations in the world that will not allow a convicted felon to enter, including Canada, Australia, the UK, and a number of other important
Well,
allies.
they do tend to make exceptions for heads of states, particularly the president of the US. They're always paths to exceptions for that. But he could
no doubt. But you can imagine
he'd have diplomatic immunity, maybe. As the president.
Imagine the indignity of having to call up from the White House and say, "Gosh, yes, we'd like to have a meeting in Canada. There's like a G7 meeting happening. We're going to need to get special permission for this convicted felon to represent our country."
Yeah. They might not make I mean, look, it is a concern. Obviously, the concern is more about it's. I remember 20 years ago we would often debate whether a convicted felon could serve as president, and that debate seems to have disappeared.
Well, he's normalized, right? This is the Trump effect, is to normalize the most extreme stuff. No, listen, until 10 years ago, nobody would consider voting for a felon.
He's convicted, but I mean, the New York thing, you could hear it's not like the confidential paper stuff is a more serious serious.
Well, those cases, stuff, but I mean, listen, those cases are extraordinary, right? If that paper about stealing confidential documents from the government, that particular case now has been dismissed by Judge Eileen Cannon, who happens to be a Trump appointee. And of course, that's going to be appealed. So she dismissed it because she felt that the prosecutor was the independent prosecutor was named illegally,
unconstitutionally.
Yes. So we'll see. He's going to appeal that.
I mean, in terms of U.S. history, I'm not great on election cycles. I mean, obviously, I can probably tell you, I don't know, 7 of the 10 last presidents, that probably 10 of the last 10 presidents, but after that it's going to get a bit sketchy for me. But I don't recall a lot about, obviously, some like Ross Perot, getting in the news cycle back in the day, and the Al Gore, George W. Bush thing and so forth, some of that. But where does it sit? Where does this election sit contextually in respect to historical U.S. elections?
Well, to get to elections this contentious, you have to go back to the 19th century. And I think a lot of Americans probably share your misunderstanding or lack of understanding about those elections. It was much more of a brawl in the 19th century than it is in the 20th century. In the 20th century, we had these big parties. They controlled their conventions. You probably heard the phrase smoke-filled room. That comes from the backroom discussions where basically candidates were vetted and announced to the rank and file members of the party. That's been the process we had for about 100 years. But in the 19th century, it was much more of a robust debate. And we had some characters who were larger than life. And don't forget, in the 19th century, you also had the Civil War. So the United States had a lot of unfinished business from its inception that had to be sorted out. And those were contentious matters. There were times in the 1850s where there were outright fist battles, like fist fights in Congress. And at one point, a anti-slavery congressman was almost beaten to death by Southern senators with their canes in the halls of Congress. So the United States does have this kind of spotty history where there have been periods of time where there was such moments of contention and such difficult issues that tempers were lost and people fought. And we had some very rough around the edges candidates as well. I mean, don't forget Andrew Jackson, who many people still admire. He supervised over a genocidal deportation of Native people from one part of the country to the central part of the country. And he was revered as a hero at the time. So, part of it is that we have these, as the country grows up and as the voter sentiment changes or citizen sentiment changes, politics is a lagging indicator. And sometimes these debates, as one part of the population wants to move forward into the future, they have to kind of drag the other half of the nation kicking and screaming behind them. And so you end up with some pretty contentious battles.
Well, let's take a quick break. And then after the break, let's talk about what this election will mean for the future of the United States in terms of the potential outcomes. We can compare a Trump presidency with a Kamala Harris, with a Harris presidency, and sort of see where we come out in terms of using our forecasting capability. What do you think about that?
Great, let's do it.
All right, let's take a quick break. You're listening to The Futurists. We're Brett King and Rob Tursek, the host. We'll be back in a minute. Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, and Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
Hey there, welcome back. You're listening to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tursek, joined by my buddy and co-host, Brett King. And this week, we're talking politics, U.S. politics, and the upcoming election. In the first half, we talked about this kind of wacky month of July that we've had with so much change happening so quickly. But in a way, it's kind of galvanized public interest and a lot of speculation about what will occur in the next 3 months as we move to the Democratic National Convention and then a national election. And so usually these U.S. elections are long drawn out affairs that last about a year because we have primaries for each party. And that helps the country get familiar with the candidates. They have to kind of barnstorm around the country. But now we're going to have a compressed cycle because Kamala Harris looks like she is a shoo-in to be the nominee. And that'll be announced or determined at the Democratic National Convention, which happens in August next month. And well, it seems very likely she's got enough delegates already. That won't be determined for sure until the convention. It'll be announced there. And then she'll have 2 months to get to introduce herself to the country and the people who don't know her yet. Now, I happen to come from California, and I voted for her. So I'm familiar with her, and I've been a supporter of hers. She was the attorney general in California. She ran a successful campaign.
Didn't Trump donate money to her as well when she was running? I think anyway.
And she is known as a tough on crime person. And she was actually quite controversial here at the time. In retrospect, she was kind of a middle of the road Democrat.
But she was tough on oil companies and banks in California, if you look historically. So she tends to support green energy. She supported the American Rescue Plan and Inflation Reduction Act. She backed the CHIPS Act. So, it seems like she's, if you can infer anything from that, you could say that she's looking to modernize the U.S. economy.
I think that's a fair point, and I think that would be generally what the Democratic Party is seeking to do. I think in a Kamala Harris administration, I think we could see her try to continue the policies that have worked well under Biden. And, bear in mind, you're hearing all this noise right now from the right. That's not very accurate. There are a lot of accusations being made about immigration, crime, and the economy. And those aren't
Biden's been, on the metrics, Biden's been one of the most successful presidents in the last 30 years. Right. I wouldn't say as successful as Clinton, but...
much more so in terms of moving legislation. He's moved...
Right, except we had a surplus with Clinton, which is a...
that's true. Yeah, that was sort of the post-Cold War benefit.
Right, but unemployment's down, inflation is under control, the stock market's doing very well. So
stock market is up 50%. No, we are absolutely rocking. So S&P is up 50% since 2021. Biden added 15 million jobs. Actually, it's almost 16 million new jobs since he was elected. Unemployment's been consistently below 4%, which is historic. wages are rising, and income inequality the gap is closing. There's been a sharp drop in illegal immigration. So people always say that there's been a rise of illegal immigration. Trump is talking about this, kind of like tidal wave of criminals coming across the border to rape and pillage. But it just isn't true. Biden's actually been very strict about denying asylum claims and shutting down the border. And so the net number of immigrants coming across the border has gone down considerably. There's been an 8.4% increase in the GDP and on average 6% growth during the Biden administration. So the economy has been booming. Now, inflation is the devil in the details. Trump pumped about $10 trillion into the economy. Biden less so. Biden is accused of being spending a lot, but actually he only put about $4 trillion in. But if you put $14 trillion into an economy in the span of 8 years, you're going to get inflation. That's a guarantee. So they've been struggling to bring that down.
Federal debt went from 14.4 trillion to 21.6 trillion.
Yeah.
Home prices rose 27.5%.
Yeah.
This is for Trump. Illegal immigration increased, but that's been increasing for 40 years. So, handgun production rose 12%. The murder rate rose to its highest level since 1997. It's great to see that.
Under Biden, or which candidate? Under Trump, you're saying. I'm sorry, I was a little unclear.
Anyway, so this is a comparison of Trump versus Bidenomics. But let's talk about the impact of this in 20 or 30 years. So if Kamala Harris gets in, what's likely? The fact is that the two greatest threats to the U.S. economy, namely artificial intelligence in terms of labor participation and climate change, we have had a little bit on climate. We haven't heard her stance on climate change. Trump really doesn't have a stance on climate change, except it's a fraud.
He's against
China,
any policy that's trying to attempt to address the issue, right?
Right, but the
Biden administration has a pretty good record for green, both climate and green energy.
Yeah, but so Kamala Harris is probably, being on the Democrat side, is going to be more green. But we have at the moment, I saw a really interesting stat. I should share this actually with the listeners. But Taiwan now is paying rice farmers to not plant new stocks of rice, so that the water can be used for semiconductor production.
Wow.
And the reason I say that is you're always going to have this competing element in the US, like why is it we're growing, cotton and,
Rice.
and avocados and things like that in the US, but we're going to need a lot of water for cooling AI and things like that. I know it sounds sort of insane, but if we start going down this path of more and more automation and more investment in AI, the energy grid's going to have to be upgraded. We've got a lot of implications that come from this on energy and infrastructure.
Well, okay. I mean, I've been hearing this comment from people because we've covered AI so many times on this show, and some people have challenged me to say, well, gee, you seem like you're very pro AI, and AI consumes incredible amounts of energy. First of all, let's put it in perspective. Very few people are using these technologies. This is a technology in its infancy. And second, it's hardly optimized for efficient operation right now. Right now, there's an arms race to create bigger and bigger and bigger models. And even Bill Gates has come out recently to say that that's not necessarily the future, that you can't get there by just adding more scale. So he thinks we'll have a couple of turns of the crank at scale, and then we'll have to go back and make these models more efficient. Just this week, we've seen both Meta and OpenAI release much more efficient small models that can perform almost as well. So I think there you can say, gosh, it's an early stage technology. Yes, it's very inefficient.
This is what Hinton has talked about, though, is the real advantage that AI has is the ability to compress intelligence, right? Which is, and that's what we're looking at, right? Getting that compression in there.
And we haven't even begun to apply AI yet to things like managing energy grids and squeezing more efficiency out of the current supply chain and our current economic system. So My sense is that you're going to see a net gain here. I don't think that this is going to just continue to grow and consume more energy. At any rate, let's get back to the national politics. So, what will the policies be? I think with the Republicans, you can expect them to be hands off on any kind of regulatory activity towards Republicans. And I think that's why people like Andreessen and Horowitz have been very vocal in their support for Donald Trump. It sort of defied logic and common sense, throwing money at a crazy
And
authoritarian madman.
Elon's been quite supportive of Trump, although that's got him into trouble with potential Tesla buyers recently.
And he's already backed away in classic Elon Musk style. A couple weeks ago,
the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, he said he was going to commit $45 million to Trump's campaign, and now this week he's saying that's not true. I never said it. So who knows? That's Elon Musk's issue. With the Democrats, it's a little bit less clear. So one of the things that the Biden administration did, and I would expect Kamala Harris will continue, is to make the Federal Trade Commission more aggressive in pursuing antitrust cases. And the reason for this is very simple. The United States has a long history of fighting against monopolies, and we should be skeptical. But our Federal Trade Commission kind of went into free fall in the last 20 years. Really hasn't brought any major cases since IBM and Microsoft.
Yeah.
Well, the Federal Trade Commission brings the case, and then the DOJ prosecutes it. So they work together. Right. And in the Federal Trade Commission, we have Lena Khan, who's relatively young, and she's notably skeptical of Silicon Valley and has this novel theory about new kinds of like network monopolies, particularly aimed at Amazon. Interestingly, she hasn't brought a case against Amazon yet, but she has a number of other antitrust cases. So you can see why Silicon Valley companies are starting to be skeptical about Democrats. Historically, they've been pretty supportive of Democrats. I think Kamala will continue to have a vigilant Federal Trade Commission, and I think the DOJ will continue to bring antitrust cases, not just against tech companies, but against large companies of all sorts. Brett, one of the things people don't talk about enough is the consolidation that's occurred across American industry in the last 20 years, really going back to the 1990s. In every major
category. It's happening right now in banking.
It's in banking, it's in hospitality, it's in airlines, and in every type of food, beverage, almost every industry that you can think of, there are about 4 companies that dominate it.
Yeah.
And that's a relatively small number. It's an interesting number because 4 is more than a monopoly, right? But it's kind of like an oligopoly. Right. But what's really interesting about that is that 2 companies, Vanguard and BlackRock, these giant index funds, are the single largest investors in all of those companies across 25 different industries. So really 2 companies.
And we talk about Bill Gates owning all this farmland, private farmland, but the fact is that BlackRock and Vanguard own more private residential property than any other group.
So the Biden administration started to look into this idea of concentrating ownership in real estate, because it is driving up the cost, not just of purchasing a home, but it's also driving up rent. It's driving up rental cost as well. And
I saw this in Sydney when I was there the other week.
They're starting to bring antitrust cases.
My son Matthew is 21 now. Shout out to Matt. He without me assisting him, I doubt there's ever going to be an opportunity for him to be able to afford to buy his own home, right? On a salary as a young guy living in Sydney. It's unaffordable for 80% of the population now to think about buying a home.
Yeah.
And so it's one of the concerns is I do tend to think that Republicans would be less inclined to act against these companies doing, sort of buying up private property and so forth, and support more of a creation of a landlord class. That's wherever you get the conservative right-wing governments working with big companies in the economy, you tend to get that sort of lower regulation approach.
Yeah, I think that would be a safe assumption under Trump, that there'd be almost no regulation. And typically under Republican administrations, they appoint regulators who come from the industry. And so there's a kind of regulatory capture phenomenon that occurs.
Yeah. And that definitely happens in the industries that, like in banking, that's definitely the case.
That's it. And so you have sort of a toothless regulator or lackluster enforcement of regulation, or they look the other way. Sometimes
Well,
down.
even they're not very innovative. Regulators are there to protect the market, and stop the market from risks, right? So what's the biggest risk you can have is changing the way the market operates. And so, when new entrants come in and there's new models coming in, then the incumbents get a lot of protection. Also because of the way US elections and policy setting is structured, which is often paid for by lobbying groups and PACs and stuff like that, right? So
and that's structural. So that doesn't matter whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in the White House, because that's likely to continue. I don't see Kamala being able to undo.
No, she couldn't break the back of that. But AI could bring in some fundamental new entrants into the system based on automation where you can't compete, as even if you are an oligopoly, particularly in something like healthcare. If you can bring in AI to do a better job at diagnosing disease than doctors, for example, and that would bring about a radical restructuring and reduction of cost in the healthcare system. You really couldn't. Obviously the health companies would try to buy that AI and so forth, but if it's generalist technology, it could get interesting. So banking, when we start talking about AI-based agency and AIs managing banks and stuff like that, you're definitely, you're talking about a fundamentally different type of organization from what you've seen historically. So I do think there is potential.
I hear what you're saying, but I tend to think that AI, at least in its current incarnation, there's kind of like increasing returns to market leaders, and that would lead to further consolidation and further concentration of power. At any rate, I think it's safe to say that Republicans of the free market philosophy and a lax approach to regulation are going to let that continue. That trend will continue. And I think, frankly, it'll be tough for a Democrat, whether it's Kamala Harris or any other president, to turn that trend around. Let's talk about foreign policy for a second. So under Trump, famously, Trump attacked NATO and threatened to pull out of NATO. And that, in some respects, sent kind of telegraphed a signal to Vladimir Putin that it was okay to invade Ukraine.
Don't have the U.S. support.
And I think one of the things that Joe Biden doesn't get enough credit for is that he came in and very quickly, very forcefully reinforced and recommitted to NATO and preserved NATO. And I think put up a credible response without escalating to the Russian attacks in Ukraine. I think that was an important signal to send to China as well.
If Trump, let's game this then. Let's use the forecasting play. So if Trump gets in and pulls out of NATO, which is a possibility, or at least makes, and then Russia, let's say Russia makes an incursion into another Central European nation instead of just Ukraine. I don't see how he can because of the military resources, but who knows? Mm-hmm. You suddenly now have a situation where the US would look a lot weaker in terms of foreign policy in the world stage, because we've, US has pulled back that influence then and sort of let Russia do its own thing. And then China is not going to stop Russia, but China is also going to...
They're watching everything that we do with Russia, and they're drawing their own conclusions.
Yeah, they're gaming it, and they're sort of saying, well, all right, if Russia can get away with this, we could certainly get away with that. So it could really change the dynamic. If you look at another 20 years, based on that sort of geopolitical gaming, then China could come in and try and not necessarily take over Taiwan militarily, but certainly economically.
They're going to flex their muscles in their neighborhood.
They'll flex their muscles some way. And then the next thing will be weakening the US dollar. We see Russia and China have been very clear about their intent to do that. So in 20 or 30 years, pulling out from NATO makes a weaker Western alliance. And it means economically giving China much more economic control, I think. Yeah. Also, when it comes to the collapse of the future US economy under, this debt burden, you need Europe's support and the EU's broad support for the US to negotiate a solution out of that. And so if you've pulled out of NATO, you're not going to get that probably. 20 years is probably not enough for that to recover.
Yeah. So imagine it this way, Brett. This is what I've read in Foreign Affairs and other places, and I think it's quite an interesting scenario. So assuming you have, let's say, if Trump wins re-election, and if Trump continues in what he's done in the past, where he pulls back from NATO and basically takes a "what's in it for me" stance Why should the U.S. be the world's policeman, and pulls back from commitments overseas? You're certainly right. Other big nations will fill the vacuum in their own region, and you start to have a multipolar world where you've got regional strong powers, and they exercise influence in their region, which means for small countries, this is unequivocally bad news. A Trump administration would be bad news for the Baltic states, for Poland, anyone who's near Ukraine. But also in Southeast Asia, there are a lot of other countries besides Taiwan that will be vulnerable. That includes South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And these aren't necessarily small by population. They're important countries. But relative to Thailand, China, they're smaller.
Yeah. Well, certainly Thailand would be much closer aligned with China economically, I think.
Yeah.
But I think you know what? I'd love to have Ian Bremmer on the show. We should try and get Ian
okay,
Bremmer.
Fine. But let's carry on our analysis.
If you're listening to the show and anyone out there is good mates with Ian Bremmer, let him know.
So another question would be, let's talk about space. Let's talk about NASA. So NASA has
certainly in the next 20 years, it's going to be growing, the space industry.
Right. And Trump created a space force, for better or for worse. I mean, I don't really know what the status of that is right now. But at the same time, I know folks at Jet Propulsion Lab here in Los Angeles, and they suffered dramatic cuts. Unfortunately, their budget's been slashed by Congress, continues to get slashed.
There's a mission that just got changed to the moon. I don't know if you heard about
Artemis.
This. Private, yeah. And no, not Artemis. No, not Artemis. No, there's another one. It's a private mission that was going to send a lander and a rover to the moon, right? And because of that, they just lost some funding. And so they've built this rover, and they're now not going to send the rover. They're going to send a lander with a mass simulator. That's a block of concrete, right? Instead of sending the rover, because
a mass simulator.
After that's what they call it, a mass simulator, right? And that was the whole thing. And for the first Falcon Heavy launch, when he put his car in, that was a mass simulator, right? It was just designed to be mass in the spacecraft. But here's the point: the funding got cut for the rover mission, so we've got a fully built rover that could go to the moon from NASA right now, and the funding's being cut to run the rover program. And China has put like 3 rovers on the moon in the last couple of years, including they did a sample return mission. So right now, the U.S. is losing the race back to the moon, to China, and it's crazy that we've got a fully built rover and we're not even going to send it to the moon.
It just shows you the lack of long-term thinking, right? Because if you can get past the day-to-day cut and thrust of politics, what's good for the country, regardless of what party you're in, is that we should maintain some edge of technological superiority. That would be in our best interest.
That's what the whole moon race was about, right?
Yeah.
Because the Soviets had shown their capabilities in doing this, and it's just not like, I think it's going to have to get to the point where I think China is going to put boots back on the moon before the U.S.
I think that's right. And they might militarize the moon. I think it's
going to be a real shock to the U.S. at that time. And
which is sometimes what the U.S. takes, right? Don't forget the first space race was the U.S. reacting to Russia, and it took us several tries.
And Gagarin, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and we had a number of missiles blow up on the launch pad. We weren't very successful initially in our own space efforts. So it's kind of that old Winston Churchill aphorism that we've said before on this show. The U.S. will always do the right thing after it's exhausted all the other possibilities.
Exactly. One of my favorite quotes.
It's so true, unfortunately for us. And what else do you think might happen under a Trump reelection?
The obvious one, which we have talked about briefly on the show previously, is the tariff issue. Trump has said he will put blanket tariffs against China,
which is basically a tax on American citizens who buy that
exactly.
Stuff.
So that's going to accelerate the debt. They're going to have tax breaks to make sure companies toe the line, because otherwise companies are going to say, well, if we're not getting the goods that we need from China for our production, we have to get them from more expensive places, and so they're going to look for tax breaks, and that whole thing leads to massive debt accumulation, right? So
and it also means nearshoring. Like you'll see, the Mexican economy will benefit because China will set up a bunch of factories there.
And
hey, Brett, let me throw a different idea.
You could have more accelerated robotics coming in to onshore as well.
That's true. Well, actually, people don't know this, but under Biden, factory building, the construction of new factories has skyrocketed in the last 3 years. It's a little known fact, but he's been talking about investing in infrastructure, and it's not just public infrastructure. $150 billion has been invested in new factory starts in the United States. So yeah, there's a desire to rebuild manufacturing capacity here.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if Trump would support that or not. Here's what we will definitely see under Trump, I think.
When he was first campaigning, he wanted to get Apple to bring their factories to the US.
He says a lot of stuff, Brett, but he doesn't act on any. He didn't follow through on any of those promises. He talked about infrastructure week, and he never accomplished anything, right? Biden accomplished more with 2 bills than Trump accomplished in his entire term in terms of infrastructure. Hey, here's one thing you can count on. And if Trump is reelected, you'll see a massive increase in corruption. And the reason I believe that is because he's managed to stack the deck at the Supreme Court. That used to be the check and balance on the executive power. But now they've given a blank check. This concept of limited immunity for official acts by the president means Trump can do whatever he wants, including he can set the DOJ against the Biden family and persecute them. And that will now be official acts, and there'll be no recourse against that. But you're going to see, Trump's administration was already famously corrupt. You're going to see much more overt corruption. And Trump famously is like about what's in it for me. Remember his requests of Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine. If he's going to do any favors for foreign governments, he's going to expect to get personal favors back.
Yeah.
This, I think, is a scary thing for the United States. We have always had some low-level corruption at every level of government here. But overt corruption from the White House, I think, will be a new thing. It'll set a new low standard if he's elected. And I think that's actually a bad signal for other nations, because the United States claims to have some kind of moral superiority. We have a kind of moral yardstick that we use to measure other countries' corruption and whether or not they're ethical.
I think over the last few years, with what we've seen, the US is just as fallible as any other government on the planet, because we're all human, and I think part of this journey is, what's really interesting is, the US can still capture the world's attention in respect to this type of thing. And so it's intriguing, the role the US has. I mean, yes, militarily and economically, they're a powerhouse, but not as much as they used to be. Certainly China's fifth-gen fighters and what they're doing in the South China Sea and so forth, no, they couldn't compete with the US military. That's not what I'm suggesting. But their technical advancements in these areas are happening very, very rapidly. And so you can bet that, they're going to lower the gap in terms of that sort of performance, certainly in economic performance. We were talking not that long ago about the real estate crash in China, and while their GDP growth has slowed, they seem to have been doing the work to reinvigorate. But longer term, their economy looks really, really healthy and positive. They've got a lot invested into automation and global trade. Now, the BRIC alliance is getting stronger. Thailand's talking about joining the BRIC alliance, like an EU, sort of union. So,
all that's highly speculative. Personally, I don't take BRICS seriously at all. Hey, Brett, here's another thing that we can expect. You talked a little bit about space, and we speculated about the militarization of space. I think another thing you'll see happen under either administration, something that will probably happen if the U.S. continues on its current foreign policy with export restrictions and other restrictions on technology. I think you're going to see the militarization of tech, or technology becomes viewed as
certainly with quantum, right? And with AI, that's certainly going to be the case for sure.
So AI is already being contemplated as, kind of a dual purpose technology that has both civilian and military uses, which means it's likely to be regulated. And think about that broadly. If AI is regulated, really we're talking about all software is going to be regulated, because AI very soon will be all software.
That makes sense.
They're considering classifying it as a kind of dual-use technology with a military application, and therefore there's going to be export controls on all software. So watch this space, but I think that's likely to occur no matter which administration we have. I know we're out of time for this week, but it sure was fun seeing you again, Brett. Thanks.
Good to chat.
And, yeah, great to catch up with you.
I guess, the listeners seem to like these shows when we chat, so we'll try and do one of these a month now.
I love it. All right, great. Over and out. And we shall see you all next week with another futurist. We'll continue to bring people on who are thinking about shaping and influencing the future. Until then, we shall see you in
the future.
Well, that's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.